So welcome to this Funka Friday webinar on this beautiful May day over here in Sweden. And this time we're going to talk about research insights on cognitive accessibility. And on the agenda today, we have first, what is cognitive accessibility about and why is it relevant for everyone? And then we go into how can cognitive accessibility increase inclusiveness of websites? And in the end, we go into the more practical details on how cognition can be integrated in accessibility work on websites. My name is Sarah Källström, and I am research strategist here at Funka, the Research and Innovation Department. And I've been involved in most of the work we've done in the research department on cognition in this past few years. So first, just as a start, what is cognition about? It seems like a very complicated word, so it's good to just have a brief definition and a common understanding of what it is before we get into the details. So cognition is really about the way we take in and process information from the environment. And when you hear the word information, most people think about spoken or written word in some way, so text in some kind of form. But in fact, there are many sources of information that we get from the environment and from our senses all the time. So think about where you are at the moment. Is it too hot or is it too cold? Do you sit comfortably? Are you perhaps standing? Is there any noise in the background? Are there any things moving around at the same time? All of this is information that the brain collects and needs to sort out and decide what to do about. And if there are many things happening at the same time, it gets more difficult to sort out and make the decision about what needs to be done, if anything. And then there's a risk of cognitive overload. And this risk is something that we all have, regardless of whether we have a cognitive impairment or not. So this is why we always say that cognitive accessibility benefits everyone, regardless of ability. And this is also something that we clearly saw in the research that we did for the European Commission recently, together with ICF, where we looked at both the barriers and also the solutions with regards to cognitive accessibility. What we could clearly see here is that many of the barriers are common for a lot of people, and they affect everyone, regardless of the ability. So just to talk about the problems first, and then we get to the solutions. So there are a number of different cognitive barriers that you can encounter on the web. And the ones that we have discussed with stakeholders in the recent research that we did, and the ones that we have found also in the literature research that we also recently conducted, are the following. So to find the most important information on our website, this can be difficult either because there's too much text or because there are too many other different elements, there's too much distraction, or perhaps the wording of the information is not very clear. So there are many different ways of failing, but finding the most important information is one key barrier. And then we have the next step, which is understanding the information. So this is really about plain language and clear language and to really be precise and to the point. Understanding and using controls is another common barrier. So this is about finding out what a specific button actually does and what happens if you press that button. If you are an uncertain user on the internet, perhaps you don't really dare to mix around with all the controls for fear of something strange happening. Keeping focused, this is also to do with finding the most important information. If there is a lot of things going on the website at the same time, it's difficult to keep focus on the information that you came to get or the task that you came to do. Managing time is also one of the difficulties that we came across in different research studies. So this is not only about timeouts. Timeouts are classical. If you go to buy a ticket or do something, online shopping or doing your tax declaration, at least in Sweden, there is a time limit. And this makes it stressful to complete the task. But it's also about the amount of information. If you have a long form, for example, with lots of steps to fill in, it could be difficult to plan how long time you need to do the task, especially if you know that you're in a time constraint for something else you need to do. You just have half an hour in between the job and getting the children from school or something like that. Or if you know that you have a limited attention span or really the physical energy to do it, then planning and managing the time on different digital services is really crucial. Filling out forms is also one thing that we saw is quite difficult. And this is because you use several of your mental abilities or mental functions at the same time. And there are different things that is happening. So you need to both remember what kind of information you should fill out. You need to understand the instructions and manage time. So all of this gets very complex when you have loads of information and loads of things happening at the same time. It gets much more compressed and much more difficult to complete it than if it is clearly structured and you have a better framework for completing the task. Managing passwords is also something that we have seen both in the literature and in the stakeholder consultations. That is, when talking to users, that is very difficult. And this is the same thing. It's because you need to remember and you need to execute, sort of input the password and to understand the framework of how you're supposed to do things. And one thing that also has come, that we've come across in different circumstances is the navigation part. So going between websites or going from one part of the website to another, it's also one thing that many find difficult. And it's got to do with keeping focused and finding the most important information, finding where you are. It's also because there are loads of things packaged into the navigation. So what are the consequences of cognitive inaccessibility? Well, for everyone, it's frustrating and people get stressed and more error prone. Of course, if there are, if the instructions are not clear and if the structure and the elements and everything is confusing, then it's much more easy to make an error. But for persons without cognitive disabilities, you lose time trying and try to find workarounds or perhaps go back and find different solutions. And of course, for the consequence for the website owner is that people simply choose a different service. They don't go back to a website that is complicated. But for a person with cognitive disabilities, there is another risk for a real barrier. And that has both to do with the barrier on the website, that if you get stuck somewhere, you can't get further. And you really, for example, if you don't manage to understand the password, then you don't get into the logged in website and you can't do the service that you came looking for. But there's also another issue here, and it's about motivation and about confidence, because it can be difficult for persons with cognitive disabilities to see whether it's their own limitations or whether it is an accessibility issue. So there is a risk of internalization of causes that leads to a lack of confidence and a lack of motivation, which in fact leads to further disabling and exclusion down the line. A bit too quick here. So if we move on a bit to how you can increase inclusion to the more positive sides of the presentation. So what we saw in the research is there are different ways, quite a lot of guidelines on cognitive accessibility, and just boil down into two very concrete components. It's about reducing stress and having a clear structure with few distractions. And then on the other side, to increase understanding. So to both have plain language, not too much text, not too many things happening at the same time, but also to provide plenty of instructions and help. And this is both help overall with what the service is about, but also in the context. So if you have a form or something that there is enough explanation on the exact element, the exact function, what are you going to provide here? What happens if you press that button? What does this and that control do? So it's about both the structure and the presentation of the information and providing help. So just to sum up a few of the insights we've seen in the research on keys to inclusion. So it's about providing a logical and structured navigation and controls on the one side. So this is about really helping you find the right information, helping to stay focused, not get distracted, and get the things done in the most smooth way possible. And then there is the issue about plain language, clear language, and support to accessing and understanding the information on the website and on the digital service. So if you do this, you will have a wider outreach. You can reach more user groups. And you can also have more users return to the website. So it's a lot of pollen in the air today. So how to integrate cognition in your work on accessibility. This is really the practical part of accessibility. And we have seen some insights on the practical tips here as well. So just before we get into the more practical details, in the pilot study that I will also talk more about shortly, we have two types of recommendations on how you can build more inclusiveness on the cognitive part. So the first are recommendations on a more general levels, and this is accessibility measures that benefit everyone and that tackle common needs. And then we have recommendations that are on the more personal side. So with add-ons and extra support beyond the general measures. And these target individual needs. And the most important thing to remember here is that you cannot go straight into and only do the add-ons and the assistive technology and think that you have covered the cognitive needs. It's really about first having a baseline of cognitive accessibility that is good for everyone. And then there will always be some people that have further needs. And for that, you can add add-ons and assistive technology, extra support. But it doesn't mean that you can just skip all the general accessibility measures that need to be there for everyone. So I'm not going to go too much into the personal side now. I'm really focusing more on the general measures that are good for everyone. So just to improve the baseline on cognitive accessibility, first, what you can do is to use cognitive guidelines and requirements. And there are quite a lot of these. And also, as usual, as always, involve users of different abilities in user testing, in user research. And finally, there are lots of things you can do, but the third key tip is really to increase awareness internally in the team. So starting with the guidelines, it's important to get familiar with guidelines for cognition beyond the legal requirements. Because one thing that we have seen, and a well-known fact, is that the legal requirements only cover a very small proportion of the needs for cognitive accessibility. And there are many different guidelines, both on general design tips and recommendations, such as the overall layout, not to have too many elements on a website, these kind of general design things. And then also quite a lot of recommendations for very specific elements and functionalities on the website, more like the requirements that are also included in the legal standard. So just to give an example of one of the guidelines that exists is that forms are usually quite difficult for users to understand. And there are guidelines to provide more understandable forms where you have a more structured progression and more visual cues, so they can become easier to handle. And I will provide you with a link to a website where you can read more about this kind of recommendations and guidelines. And then, of course, as always, involve the users. And this is one key thing here, is to start early on in the process. When we talked to users and user groups in the recent research for the European Commission, there was quite a lot of groups that said, okay, we have people coming to us with assistive technology or other technological solutions that they want us to try out, but it's too late in the process. They have already designed everything, it's finished, and it doesn't really correspond to our user needs. So the key thing here is really to start early in the process to talk to the users, so that you're sure that you're actually addressing the actual needs. And as always, it can be daunting to do a lot of user tests, but it's better to start small and to talk to some users than to not do it at all. And also to try to get diversity into the user groups and involve persons with different abilities. So one of the key insights that we saw in the recent study is that persons with cognitive disabilities are often the first to react to issues of usability and understandability that affect all users. And this has to do with the thing that we saw on consequences, meaning that for a person without a cognitive disability, it can be in users, but you try to find a workaround. Whether a person who is more sensitive to an overload of information will say, stop, I don't understand this, you have to do something about it straight away. And then we have a few tips on increasing awareness. And the top tip is, of course, to read up on cognitive accessibility and share knowledge within the team. And also to take every opportunity to really involve and talk to people of different abilities. And the key tip to reading up is the European Commission pilot project study, Inclusive Web Accessibility for Persons with Cognitive Disabilities, that Funke and ICF recently completed on behalf of the European Commission. I purposefully did not put the link here because it's quite long and complicated, so we will share it in an email. We can also probably put it in chat here, and we will share it after the webinar. And the other thing about awareness is that it's much more easy to understand an issue if you get into it on a practical level. So there are, for example, virtual reality exercises that lets you get some insights in how it can be to have cognitive disability at the workplace. I will provide the link for that as well at the end of the presentation. And another key tip is to test assistive technology, to just see what it does and doesn't do. Some people may think that it's the magical solution to everything, and it's not really the case. It's really useful, but it's also good to see what are the limitations and where do you actually have to do your groundwork on cognitive accessibility for everyone. So just to end up with a few useful resources, we have the cogrec.eu, where you can see different guidelines on cognitive accessibility and test out prototypes of accessible and non-accessible websites to see what difference a few measurable requirements on cognitive accessibility actually makes for the users. We have a Swedish website on the virtual reality exercises, but there are a few of them that are subtitled into English. And it's called Inlevelse ger insikt.se, where you can actually yourself do a virtual empathy exercise to find out how different situations at the workplace can be experienced by persons with cognitive disabilities. We also have the Buddy project, so develop.buddyproject.eu, where you can see more about, can find out more about the different types of assistive technology that exist for persons with cognitive disabilities. And just to end up with the key message, that websites that are easier to understand and navigate are more attractive and usable to everyone. And please do get in touch with us if you have more information to share. We're always happy to engage in new research activities and to join up with people. But also, if you have any more questions, please contact us at cognition@funke.com. Let's see if we have any questions. One question is, so thanks for sharing. Are you also actively contributing to WCAG 3 in these parts, adding success criteria and guidelines for cognitive accessibility? We have been in contact with W3C for this, so there are ongoing discussions. We're also in discussions with the other standardization organizations. So of course, all of this is a joint work with people who are very committed on different fronts. And the next question is, can you give some examples of where to find cognitive guidelines and requirements? There is a whole list of these guidelines and requirements in the pilot study, and we will provide you with the link to this. Let's see if I can manage to find it now quickly. Otherwise, we will send it out to everybody who participated in the webinar. And then we have a question on involving users is the best way for sure, but how to get a good representation of all different disabilities. And it's really difficult can be difficult to do everyone at once. So one way of approaching this could also be to do it in segments and to really look at one type of users at the time and then compare between the different user groups. What we found in the research studies, this is quite interesting. In fact, we found that a lot of studies focus only on persons with one type of needs and get very much into detail on that one. But when you look at the whole line of different studies, there are a lot of things that overlap. So this is I would really make that a shout out to the research community, that we need to do more research on what are the commonalities between the different user groups as well. And here we have a long question on, when you say clear structure and navigation, what does it mean? Should we guide the users through sequential steps with only backward and forward navigational choices? However, other users may want to have more navigational choices, gamification pattern choices. And this is a really interesting question, because there are different levels of this, I would say. On a novel level, you can do some things that are easy for everyone to understand, like having few elements on a website. And when you have something a bit more complex, a form, it would be easier to do user tests to see what exactly is the user trying to do in the form or formula, or the sequence that you have in mind, how are people reacting, and try to find what is the best way for the most people in that particular type of context. So on the one hand, we have the very broad guidelines, like don't have too much elements. And then when it comes to the details, it could be more beneficial to go into more technical and detailed kind of guidelines. The question is, another question is if we can recommend any specific design guidelines. And again, I would refer to the study. Let's see, are the guidelines or efforts to simplify or standardize the wide variety of cookie preference notices and options? Those can be challenging. Yeah, that is a really, really interesting research question. And when you talk about cookies, it's also all kinds of consents really that we're talking about. And these are quite complex and long texts. I haven't seen, well, we couldn't see in the study we did, we couldn't see so much information about this specific issue. Perhaps it's because it's a very recent thing that happened in the past few years. So that would be, I mean, if anybody is up for joining us in the research project on that issue, it would be great. And I think we can close it here. Thank you very much for your attention. It's been really a pleasure to be able to discuss on so many questions. I'm really happy to see that there's such an interest for this topic.